Let's now leave the topics of rendering and state and turn towards another essential part of React applications that we haven't really talked about yet, and that's events. So in this lecture, we will learn how React handles events and how they work behind the scenes. But let's start with a quick refresher on how event propagation and event delegation work in the DOM, because this is important to understand how React works, and also because I believe that many people don't have a good grasp on how events actually work in the browser. So let's consider this tree of DOM elements. And note that this really is a DOM tree, so not a fiber tree or a React element tree. And now let's say that some event happens, like a click on one of the three buttons. And so here is what's gonna happen in the browser. As soon as the event fires, a new event object will be created, but it will not be created where the click actually happened. Instead, the object will be created at the root of the document, so at the very top of the tree. From there, the event will then travel down the entire tree during the so-called capturing phase, all the way until it reaches the target element. And the target element is simply the element on which the event was actually first triggered. So at the target, we can choose to handle the event by placing an event handler function on that element, which usually is exactly what we do. Then, immediately after the target element has been reached, the event object travels all the way back up the entire tree during the so-called bubbling phase. Now, there are two very important things to understand about this process. The first is that during the capturing and bubbling phase, the event really goes through every single child and parent element one by one. In fact, it's as if the event originated or happened in each of these DOM elements. The second important thing is that by default, event handlers listen to events not only on the target element, but also during the bubbling phase. So if we put these two things together, it means that every single event handler in a parent element will also be executed during the bubbling phase, as long as it's also listening for the same type of event. For example, if we added another click event handler to the header element, then during this whole process, both the handlers at the target and the header element would be executed when the click happens. Now, sometimes we actually don't want this behavior, and so in that case, we can prevent the event from bubbling up any further simply by calling the stop propagation method on the event object. And this works in vanilla JavaScript and also in React, but it's actually very rarely necessary, so only use this if there really is no other solution. Okay, so this is essentially how events work in the browser. Now, the fact that events bubble like this allows developers to implement a very common and very useful technique called event delegation. So, with event delegation, we can handle events for multiple elements in one central place, which is one of the parent elements. So, imagine that instead of 3 buttons, there would be like 1,000 buttons. Now, if we wanted to handle events on all of them, each button would have to have its own copy of the event handler function, which could become problematic for the app's performance and memory usage. So instead, by using event delegation, we can simply add just one handler function to the first parent element of these buttons. Then, when a click happens on one of the buttons, the event will bubble up to the options div in this example, where we can then use the event's target property in order to check whether the event originated from one of the buttons or not. And if it did, we can then handle the event in this central event handler function. Now, if you took my JavaScript course, then you will already know how to do this in practice, because, in fact, we do this all the time in vanilla JavaScript applications. However, in React apps, it's actually not so common for us to use this technique. But that might leave you wondering, if this is actually not important in React, then why are we even talking about this? Well, for two reasons. First, because sometimes you find some strange behaviors related to events in your applications, which might actually have to do with event bubbling. And so, as a good React developer, you always want to understand exactly what's going on in order to fix these problems. And the second reason is that this is actually what React does behind the scenes with our events. And so let's take a look at that. So let's consider this same DOM tree, and let's say again that we want to attach an event handler to one of the buttons or even to some other DOM element. And this is what that would look like in React code. So we would simply use the onClick prop to listen for click events and then pass it a function. So that's really easy, right? Now, if we think about how React actually registers these event handlers behind the scenes, we might believe that it would look something like this. So React might select the button and then add the event handler to that element. So that sounds pretty logical, right? However, this is actually not what React does internally. Instead, what React actually does is to register this and all other event handler functions to the root DOM container. And that root container is simply the DOM element in which the React app is displayed. So if we use the default of create React app, that's usually the div element with an ID set to root. So again, instead of selecting the button where we actually placed our event handler, we can imagine that React selects the root element and then adds all our event handlers to that element. And I say imagine because the way React does all this behind the scenes is actually a lot more complex than this, but that's not really worth diving into here. The only thing that's worth knowing is that React physically registers one event handler function per event type, and it does so at the root node of the fiber tree during the render phase. So if we have multiple onClick handlers in our code, React will actually somehow bundle them all together and just add one big onClick handler to the root node of the fiber tree. And so this is yet another important function of the fiber tree. But anyway, what this means is that behind the scenes, React actually performs event delegation for all events in our applications. So we can say that React delegates all events to the root DOM container because that's where they will actually get handled, not in the place where we thought we registered them. And so this works exactly how we just learned in the previous slide. So again, whenever a click happens on the button, a new event object is fired off, which will then travel down the DOM tree until it reaches the target element. From there, the event will bubble back up. Then, as soon as the event reaches the root container where React registered all our handlers, the event will actually finally get handled according to whatever handlers match the event and the target element. And finally, once that's all done, the event of course continues bubbling up until it disappears into nowhere. And the beauty of this is that it all happens automatically and invisibly just to make our React apps yet a little bit more performant. Now, just one small detail that I want you to notice is that it's really the DOM tree that matters here, not the component tree. So just because one component is a child of another component, that doesn't mean that the same is true in the displayed DOM tree. So just keep that in mind when thinking about bubbling in React applications. Alright, so we talked a lot about events and event objects, and so now let's finish by taking a look at how these event objects actually work behind the scenes. So Whenever we declare an event handler like this one, React gives us access to the event object that was created, just like in vanilla JavaScript. However, in React, this event object is actually different. So in vanilla JavaScript, we simply get access to the native DOM event object. For example, pointer event, mouse event, keyboard event, and many others. React, on the other hand, will give us something called a synthetic event, which is basically a thin wrapper around the DOM's native event object. And by wrapper, we simply mean that synthetic events are pretty similar to native event objects, but they just add or change some functionalities on top of them. So these synthetic events have the same interface as native event objects, and that includes the important methods stop propagation and prevent default. What's special about synthetic events though, and one of the reasons why the React team decided to implement them, is the fact that they fix some browser inconsistencies, making it so that events work in the exact same way in all browsers. The React team also decided that all of the most important synthetic events actually bubble, including the focus, blur, and change events, which usually do not bubble. The only exception here is the scroll event, which does also not bubble in React. Okay, and now to finish, I want to quickly mention some differences between how event handlers work in React and vanilla JavaScript. The first one is that in React, the prop name to attach an event handler are named using camel case, so something like onClick with an uppercase C. In HTML, on the other hand, it would be onClick all lowercase, and if we used an add event listener in vanilla JavaScript, the event would simply be called click, so without the on prefix. Now, in vanilla JavaScript, whenever we want to stop the default behavior of the browser in response to an event, we can return false from the event handler function. And the big example of that is the browser automatically reloading the page when we submit a form. However, if we would attempt to return false in a React event handler, that would simply not work. So in React, the only way to prevent the browser's default behavior is to call prevent default on the synthetic event object. And finally, in the rare event that you need to handle an event in the capturing phase rather than in the bubbling phase, you can simply attach capture to the event handler name. For example, onClick capture instead of just onClick. But most likely you will never use this, so just keep this somewhere in the back of your mind. Alright, so what we just learned in this slide is basically everything that you need to know in practice in order to successfully work with events in React. The rest all happens invisibly behind the scenes, but I hope that you also found the rest of the lecture interesting and that it gave you even more confidence in working with events in your applications.